Together we create possible. Together we create possible.
Hello and welcome to this podcast. Young Epilepsy aims to provide podcasts with detailed information and topics that we can discuss that will help support young people and families with epilepsy. We offer to help families, healthcare professionals, educational professionals with information that's vital in caring for our young people. My name's Kirsten McHale. I'm the epilepsy nurse consultant and the head of health services at Young Epilepsy. I'm delighted to say that we're bringing you these podcasts today from our 15th annual research retreat. Before we jump into our podcast today, I'd just like to take a minute to thank our supporters. Today's podcast was brought to you by Young Medical, who is at the forefront of solutions in epilepsy management. Our supporters do not influence our podcasts, creations or topics that we choose to talk about. Guests and questions are led by Young Epilepsy and our community. Welcome. I'd just like to introduce my guest today. I am delighted to say on our podcast we have Mark Richardson, who is a Professor of Epilepsy, and he's the head of the School of Neurosciences at King's College London, and he's a consultant neurologist in the Epilepsy Centre at King's College Hospital. And I've got lovely Dr. Colin Dunkley, who is a consultant paediatrician and a clinical lead for Epilepsy 12. And also joining us today is Spencer, who is our Youth Voice Network member and a very proud trustee. Welcome. So I'd like to start off the podcast today with a few questions. I'm going to start with Colin. Are you happy for me to call you Colin? Would you like to? We like to be a bit informal. Colin, tell me something really fun about yourself, just to start with. Something that you like to do in your spare time.
Well, I have three worlds on my professional world that I often put into social media, but I've got two other worlds that I post. So one's about food.
Oh.
So in some worlds I post about food and recipes, and in another world I post pictures of empty benches.
Oh.
So that's a bit bizarre, isn't it?
A little.
But there you go. So I've got contrasting worlds that I try and keep apart.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Maybe I'm revealing too much.
No, we love it. We literally love it. Thank you. So some questions that we think our listeners would really like to know about. Yeah. Colin, can you explain to us what happens at the initial point of somebody being diagnosed with epilepsy? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's quite a tricky question to ask, actually, because often that point of diagnosis isn't that clear. You may well have met the child, the parents, other professionals around that child before, and the diagnosis can emerge over time. So sometimes that point where it becomes clear that this is epilepsy, that this person has had some seizures, you think they're epileptic, and there's a risk that they're going to happen again, is not always marked out. And sometimes you can sort of creep into that moment and you suddenly realise, gosh, we're thinking this is epilepsy, we're treating this as epilepsy, we're beginning to think about risk in the future. So, so often it sort of passes you by, and you only, maybe when you look back and you think, oh, that was the moment when we started to change tack.
That's really
for some, it's really clear,
yeah,
and it's obvious that the person has had a number of seizures, they're clearly epileptic, and you think this person's going to have more seizures, we need to do something. But for others, it's a bit more subtle, I think.
I think it's difficult as well because I think parents Google a lot of things, and you can find out that if you've had 2 or more seizures over a 24-hour period, or that straight away it's an epilepsy, or they could have seen their GP who would have gone, oh, this potentially is an epilepsy, so they might have given you that little bit of a label before you've got to see somebody like you. So it's almost implanted in people's mind before they get to you, and then sometimes it might not even be an epilepsy.
Yeah, you have to be both independent and sort of challenging what you think is going on, but also empathetic and insightful into what others might be saying. So yeah, you have to have your wits about you, because you can put your foot in it for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah,
you can call it epilepsy when it's not. You can miss it when it is, and both of those are tricky.
Yeah, very
So,
tricky.
yeah, it's quite a lot to juggle.
It is. So
Yeah.
that's why people need experts, isn't it? Like you to see.
I think so, but you have to realise that all the expertise doesn't reside with you. You're so dependent on what you hear and what you're told, and the emerging story. So yeah, if you think you're the expert, you can go wrong. So you have to relinquish that quite a lot, really.
So Colin, it leads me quite nicely on to tests and investigations. So what are some of the most common tests that you would rely on to help and support you with your diagnosis process?
Yeah, I think, well, before you do tests, you have to get a good story, and then often we're relying on good video as well. So you really do need those things up front before you can work out what good tests look like. And we often go wrong if you jump for a test too soon, because it'll only tell you part of what you want to know or something you don't want to know. The commonest three tests are an EEG, so an electroencephalogram, where you can see the electric footprint of the brain, or MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, where you take a picture of the brain, or an ECG is quite common as well, but we're interested in the heart rhythm in the mix. So those three tests are the ones that play out, and most children, but not all, will have all of those at some point.
And do families ask you lots of questions about these tests? Because in my world, from an epilepsy nurse point of view, parents feel, I think they hear about all these tests you're going to put them through for, and then they come to someone like me and go, God, what does that actually mean? So do parents feel confident to come and talk to you and say, actually, what are those tests and what do they mean?
I think some do, but I think people don't always ask what they're thinking, and they're so bamboo, because we're often seeing families in this quite staged situation, and it's a bit weird, and so often the obvious questions get squeezed out, and I am conscious that after a clinic meeting, all sorts of questions could be left unasked or unanswered. Yeah, so I think what the test's for, what are we actually looking for, what might it show, are often missed conversations. So it is tricky, so it doesn't surprise me if those questions then find their way to ask other people.
Because I found in my clinics, when I've sat in and talked about what tests we're going to put people through for, children and young people, it can be quite overwhelming for families, because you're right, they want to ask, but then they don't think there's time pressures. They're very much aware that you've only got a certain amount of time with them, and it feels like there's things that they want to talk about. Is one of the questions we always kind of ask is what's the difficulty, what's the obstacles that a family are going to come across when they're trying to get a diagnosis of epilepsy, and I think all of those bits have to come together. What are the obstacles that you would explain to families that might take the time, for example?
You could see when I was trying to clumsily describe the tests how tricky it is, and you can easily get to rabbit holes where you talk about everything apart from what's needed. But yeah, there's lots of obstacles. So often there's a waiting list. The urgency around what, in your perspective as a clinician, may differ from the young person's or the parents' sense of urgency. They may want things done there and then.
Oh, they do. Most of the time.
Sometimes waiting is useful, and sometimes in the wait you get better information, or other things may have happened. So doing everything all at once is not necessarily the right thing, but you can understand there's an impatience to get through the tests. And sometimes one test only becomes needed when you get the results of the other test. So, for example, the EEG may give you results that mean you don't need to do the MRI. So this sort of sequential waiting can add to the difficulty. And then some children are not going to like the test or tolerate the test. So EEG may be tricky or trickier than expected. The scan may be difficult. It might need sedation or a general anaesthetic, and all those differences as you individualise the test to the child, the young person, can affect the weight and fuel that impatience. And then all this time, the child, the family wants something doing, they want to know, all this uncertainty, they want to go away. So there's that tension between going through these steps and holding your nerve and trying to do the right thing, which always plays out. And some you need to fast track and push things and get things moving faster, and others you need to settle and take your time. It differs, I think, from situation to situation.
Absolutely, it's all individualised, isn't it? But I think a lot that I hear in my epilepsy nurse world is waiting times vary hugely in different areas of the country for your wait for EEG, for example. Quite a few of families that I've worked with over the years will often want to pay privately if they can to get that done quicker because they want those answers quicker. And we understand that as epilepsy nurses. We know that we're trying to hold that. We're bridging that gap between seeing you and all the questions that these families have to ask, and trying to navigate that journey is really difficult. And also what's come up now is looking at the future and what we're doing with technology nowadays is one of the questions that I'd like to ask you is, do all hospitals have access to advanced technologies like for genetic testing, for anything sort of looking at the future and diagnosing epilepsies? Do all hospitals have access to those sorts of tests?
I think that's one of the advantages of working in the NHS is for most patients they can access most things they need. What's different though is they may not be able to access it locally. So some children will benefit from things very much on their doorstep. Others are going to have to travel miles, and because some of these tests are quite specialist. So, for example, I work in Mansfield. For children to have the EEG, they always have to go to Nottingham. We're trying to think of ways to bring the EEG to the child, but it's tricky. And so I think that's the main difference is where some tests are concentrated in certain centres. They're not quite so accessible. But I think most tests most people can have. It's just navigating the literal journey can be tricky. Yeah.
So with things like the new genetic testing, is this something that we're going to look at in the future for improving? It's not going to improve things now for individuals, but looking down the line, what do you think that's going to look like for helping and supporting diagnosis in the future?
I don't think we quite know yet. I mean, it's clearly going to change everything we do, and you can see what's coming, and it provides lots of value right now for the children who get that genetic test, but it takes too long at the moment. So most children, when you do the test, it's where I work, it's over 6 months before the result comes. So it still brings value, but there's huge delay for the whole genome sequencing. But each time it comes, it's useful, and then the world of genetics is getting bigger and bigger, and we're identifying more genes. And I think we'll have to get to the point where we can get a gene test result as quickly as a ECG or any other blood test. Some of those delays are artificial and us getting used to new technology and bottlenecks. So yeah, having the test done much more quickly, or even in advance of the diagnosis of epilepsy, means some types of epilepsy, it'd be useful to know the gene result almost before the seizure, which is a sort of different way of thinking. So I think for some situations we may need to think about genetic testing, when a child's born or at other points in their health journey rather than when the seizure hits. But we haven't worked all this out yet. I can just feel what's coming.
There is a lot coming, isn't there? There is a lot coming. Even just discussing the forms themselves can be quite time-consuming. To consent to the genetic testing can be quite
there's a lot to get your head round, and you as a professional, it's quite a struggle conceptually to explain, and it is really difficult for the child, the family, to understand, because it's still quite abstract and uncertain, and you do the test and you're not quite sure what's going to come out the other end.
Absolutely, because when you try to explain to families, we're not just looking at epilepsy genes. This could pull out other anomalies.
Yeah.
And that's quite a lot for families to take on board. But I think a lot of my families, they crave that diagnosis because it gives them a prognosis, and we can say how things are going to pan out for them and what support that we can give them down the line. With that, what do you think is the most important role that we as healthcare professionals have to support families?
We've got to go with them. We've got to be authentic, true, honest, and adjust how we work to fit with the person, both because the person's going to have an individual epilepsy that impacts in their way, but because things change and it's unpredictable, and you have to be, you know, at the onset you rarely know where you're going to end up, so you have to be prepared to go with them. And I think, you know, the current health models are very much based on inpatient assessment or outpatient clinic, and it's very episodic, and I think we need to find ways to be more available when the person needs it, which is often in between appointments. So that sort of accessibility and the ability to receive information and give information and accompany person on their life journey, not our patient journey, is really a big change. And I think digital and doing health differently and thinking about health in a different way and make it more patient-centred, literally where the person is, children, whether that might be school or college or nursery, at home, not in your clinic, is really important for epilepsy. But it needs a shift in the way we do health. But I think it's particularly relevant for epilepsy because the way it affects people, it really invades their own life where they are, and it's so disruptive and impactful. So we're often in the wrong place in health to solve that. So I think there's a lot of adjustment to be made. But if you're with the person and you're authentic and true and honest, I think that goes a long way.
Oh, absolutely! I completely agree with you, and I think it's vital. Like the role of the epilepsy nurse is key, I think, to helping and supporting families. I think our job role is very unique. We're lucky to have that. I feel privileged to have that job role because for me, we see these families together normally, and then the nurse goes off and does lots of stuff. But we're on that journey for a long time with that family. We're not just going to see them one or two times. We're going to be with this family for a lot of years, and so you have to be honest. You have to be transparent, and I think you have the better relationships with families when you are honest with them. And it's a rocky road, I think, for most families. And I got my very first epilepsy nurse job off the back of the Epilepsy 12 audit because our local district general hospital didn't have that service. So it was so needed. But I think we find we're still looking for more epilepsy nurses to support. We're still not doing as much as we would like to.
Yeah, I can't imagine epilepsy care working without a specialist nurse, fundamental, and we don't have enough. So, I think probably we need as many epilepsy specialist nurses in the system as there are diabetes specialist nurses.
Wouldn't that be brilliant?
And often services will have 2 or 3 times the number, and the needs for people with epilepsy are increasing. So it's not just seizures and being responsive; it's their mental health, it's their transition, it's availability, explaining things, carrying them, and then standing back as well when needed. So that the way that specialist nurses do that is amazing. It's such a fundamental part of the team, and you can't use the nurse to plug gaps in the rest of the system because they can't be nurses where the quality comes from. So the whole workforce, I think, around the young person needs really transforming, and I think we're only just started with that. We've got a long way to go.
We've got a long way to go. Colin, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We're going to talk today about solutions and technological advances. So, Mark, talk to me about what role does technology play in improving the diagnosis of a person with epilepsy?
So yeah, thanks for that question. As Colin mentioned earlier on, at the initial diagnosis, most children and young people with epilepsy are likely to have, for example, an EEG and an MRI brain scan. So there have been an enormous number of technological advances over the last 25, 30 years. And I would say that they're in 2 broad areas. One is collecting the information better with more advanced technology, and the other is around interpreting that information. So particularly the emergence of sophisticated software tools and artificial intelligence that help us extract information in more detail and hopefully more accurately from those tests that are carried out. So for example, in MRI brain scanning, if you had a scan 20 years ago, you would have been in a very claustrophobic, very tight tube. It would have been incredibly noisy. The scan might have taken half an hour or 40 minutes. But as scanning technologies advanced enormously, there are scanners that are much more open and less claustrophobic. The scanning time is much shorter. And we're starting to see new approaches to MRI scanning emerging that mean that the scanner is almost silent. And for babies and young children to be able to scan in that quiet, peaceful, silent environment, I think is an enormous advantage. So again, Colin mentioned that sometimes children might find it difficult to lie still in the scanner, but if it's less claustrophobic, less noisy, that can be much easier for that person to go through the scanning. We're also seeing so thinking about how data are interpreted using software, EEG data or MRI scanning data, one of the obstacles to getting a diagnosis quickly is that in some instances those tests can appear to be completely normal. So we get the information from the EEG or an MRI, and an expert will look at that very carefully and might not actually be able to identify any abnormality. And then we might need to do the test again and perhaps another time. But there are beginning to emerge tools that provide some diagnostic support for the expert. So tools that can go through all of the EEG data or the brain scan and highlight aspects of that information that the expert might need to focus on more closely. And that can increase the likelihood that we can find abnormalities in those tests.
Is that using AI, Mark? Using AI to analyse that?
In some instances, yes. But what's already in the kind of data evaluation workflow, if you like, are tools that are just simply software that makes automated measurements. So, for example, in MRI brain scanning, software that can identify different parts of the brain and can measure how big they are, can evaluate the what's called the signal quality in those parts of the brain, and can immediately draw attention to something that might look normal even to a really well-trained expert, but actually if you make the measurements, it isn't quite normal. And that can then reveal things that weren't there before. So those kinds of things are already used by clinicians. But what we're seeing now is a very, very rapid advancement of artificial intelligence methods. So this often sounds worrying and maybe even a bit sinister. You know, this is some intelligent machine. It really isn't that. It's just a sophisticated software that can take an enormous amount of information that already exists. So for example, in the brain scanning world, it can look at tens of thousands of brain scans that have already been collected, that have already been assessed by an expert, and it can then apply that knowledge to a scan that's just been collected and bring more information and more kind of subtlety to evaluating that scan than the human expert could do. So things like that are very rapidly in development. And you know, what we're seeing is hospitals and clinicians and even the legal framework around that struggling to catch up with how fast that's moving. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how quickly and how widely tools like that are taken up. But it's just over the horizon. It's definitely coming.
So would you say then we would still need human input to clinicians to look at the data that's collected, even though it's gone through all of that software to start with? We're still going to need your expert opinions at the end of the day.
So I would say absolutely 100% yes. And this is not about making people or experts redundant in this process. It's about making them more effective. So for example, there's a very well-developed AI-supported EEG review system. It's not yet deployed in the real world, but it's been used in research an enormous amount. And this EEG system is as accurate as a human expert at deciding that an EEG is normal. So what that might enable an expert to do is to put kind of to the back of their list of things to do all of the EEGs that the AI system thinks is normal. You can do them just at the end of the day, just go through those very quickly, and you can concentrate on the EEGs that the system thinks is abnormal, that you really need to check what that AI system has believed about those EEGs and confirm that diagnosis. But it would make the workflow much more efficient. Do the difficult stuff first.
Would it be quicker though,
Yeah.
Mark? Because when you think of the time of a
Yes.
neurophysiologist, for example, and analysing all of that, so that would be a quicker alternative.
Absolutely. So it would hopefully do two things. It would make things quicker and more accurate. And there are lots of waiting times in the NHS for these diagnostic tests, and EEG is definitely one potential bottleneck in the system. And the bottleneck there is often about people, and the amount of time it takes to review an EEG. So if you can reduce that, and if you can make it more accurate so that you perhaps don't need to repeat so many EEGs, there's both an efficiency gain and a gain of better diagnosis for children and young people with epilepsy.
It's fascinating. I think it's absolutely fascinating. I think moving forward, I think AI is going to play a huge part in what we do, and I think the test results also. What do you think, Colin?
Yeah, no, absolutely. We need as much intelligence as we can get, and I don't think it needs to be an either or. We can have human intelligence and artificial intelligence, and I think it will work best when those are serving each other, and you get the best of both worlds. But we haven't quite worked out our relationship with AI. We have trouble with human relationships
Yes,
with
we
different
do.
forms. I think it's going to be a similar journey with AI and how we get the best from it.
Thank you. Mark, do you think this would be better for children and families? Do you think they'd appreciate it more? I know in my experience, a routine EEG can take a very long time on a waiting list, and then you might need a sleep EEG, and then you might need a video telemetry, and I think all of those things take a lot of time to get to, and then sometimes it's also quite expensive when we look at the costings of things. And do you think this is going to improve a journey for the families?
I'm sure it will. I'm not sure. I think it's quite hard to scan the horizon too far ahead and to know exactly what this is going to look like. Alongside those developments in AI, there's also developments in the physical devices, in the technology. And there's a huge amount of technical development in EEG systems that would be suitable for use at home. So purely in the research domain, there's already been work in a number of different centres around the world with relatively simple EEG devices that the family could use themselves at home. So you could be trained, for example, to put on an EEG cap, collect some information yourself on a machine. And in my own centre, we've worked with that where we've just simply mailed out this equipment, done a training over Zoom, collected some EEG, and then looked at that information. And in some instances, we've seen information that's immediately diagnostic of EEG. But if you're going to scale up the number of different ways in which you collect EEG and be collecting EEG at home or in your GP surgery as well as in a hospital, there's going to be an enormous increase in just simply the sheer amount of EEG information that an expert has to report. And again, that's a challenge for how we manage that information, and AI systems or other software systems to increase the workflow, get more EEG reviewed more quickly and more accurately is going to be very helpful with that. But I would predict that EEG will become more ubiquitous. It won't just be in hospital expert centres, but it'll be available much closer to home. And in some instances, it may be these new systems that people can use themselves, or it may be EEG equipment that looks much more like conventional EEG equipment, and somebody might come out to your home to do an EEG at home. In some parts of the world, that's a very normal thing to do.
Wow.
Yeah, sure. So I think I think EEG is going through a kind of really interesting transition in terms of both the hardware and the software, and how we manage all of the information and how EEG might be reported. And I think that will speed up the diagnostic process and make it more accurate.
Absolutely. What about for the cohort of young people who have extreme sensory needs? What about, is there a way of looking at non-touchable, non-wearable devices in the future that you think would be of benefit to families, that one may not be able to get their young person to a hospital or a clinic that can do an EEG, or they wouldn't tolerate that from a sensory point of view? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. Reflecting on my own career, the item of technology that's made the most difference to my practice is the mobile phone. And the aspect of the phone that's made the change is the video.
Absolutely.
And seeing a video of an event isn't necessarily something that means I can definitely make a diagnosis. Sometimes the video still doesn't make it clear, but in some instances a video is absolute gold dust, and I can look at that video and say, okay, I'm really clear what this attack is. And although I would never say to any carer or family member or friend, just stand back and take a video, obviously you need to take care of the child, the young person first and foremost. But if there's an opportunity for somebody in the vicinity to take a video, that's enormously helpful. So what's starting to emerge now is, as video technology has become vastly cheaper, is video cameras on little tripod stands that you can just position in the home, and they can just be collecting video all of the time. And then if the child, the young person who we're concerned about, has an event with the video running, then we've got a video of the event, and that might not need any close interaction with that person at all. It might be very unobtrusive, and that might be enormously helpful, and certainly I've seen that be useful. It comes with another challenge, and the challenge, again, as I mentioned for the EEG, is simply the amount of information that comes in. So if you've got video running all the time, and you've got days and days, maybe even weeks and weeks of video, there's no way a human being could go through all of that and just look for events. So you again need some kind of AI system, at least to identify events that might be seizures that an expert can then go in and have a look at. Those kinds of cameras, they can be set up around the home. If there's a concern about events at night, they could be put into somebody's bedroom and work with infrared light. So, all of the lights would be out and it would appear to be dark, but the camera can still run very well. So I think that kind of technology is potentially very helpful.
I think I'm very convinced this is the way forward in our world. I think it's going to be a very interesting future for diagnosis and the use of EEG. With that in mind, is there a way that young people and their families can stay informed about the latest technical advances? Is there a way, us as clinicians, sometimes we don't get to hear about them as often or as quick as we'd like to. Is there a way that families, without using the Google element, is there a way that families can find out about these things?
There should be. I have to say, and I would point the finger of blame at people like me. I don't think there is anywhere near enough information out there that is not so very technical and so obviously aimed at scientists and clinicians that it's easily accessible. It's a real change has occurred in the way research funders expect researchers to communicate the outcomes of research. So it's quite routine in a research grant these days to have a component that's about spreading that information and making sure that it's communicated well. in blogs and webcasts and websites and so on, that are aimed at people with epilepsy and their families rather than aimed at other scientists or other clinicians. I don't think we do that enough. I think there's huge opportunity to do that better. There's quite a lot of voluntary sector organizations that I think do that very well. But there's certainly a road to travel to get enough information out there so that everybody's really clear what's happening in the research domain. There is a lot happening.
Absolutely. And I think, especially in my clinics, in my nurse-led clinics, I have some families that turn up and parents are super clued up and they know more than we do sometimes. And you think, oh gosh, you caught me on the back foot. I'm going to have to go away and look at that up. So Mark, what do you think the future looks like? What are we going to expect? In summary, what would you say that we've got to look forward to?
I would say probably three things. One is the kind of information that we're comfortable and know about already being collected in better ways. So I'm talking about new systems to collect the EEG, new ways of brain scanning that are not completely different, but they're quicker, faster, less obtrusive, less difficult. So that's going on all the time. Then a second thing is around then how that information is interpreted and analyzed using computers alongside expert people in order to make diagnosis quicker and more accurate. And then the third thing is the kind of unknown. It's new technology doing new things. And there's a certain amount of that in the epilepsy domain, things that you could wear or implanted under the skin that might be able to detect seizure-related activity, either movement or EEG activity or heart rate changes in ways that we've never done before. And there are one or two systems like that already coming into the clinical domain, not much. But I think there'll be a lot more of the kind of unknown. For example, I was talking to somebody the other day who is looking at how you might take a sweat sample after an event and analyze it for particular constituents that we know the skin secretes during seizures. And that might be just, you swab your armpit and you send it off to your doctor. That's totally different from anything we've done before. And I suspect there'll be more of that. We hadn't thought of this before happening over the next few years.
It's fascinating. I find it incredibly fascinating, I think, for us who are super passionate about epilepsy and the way we can make lives of children and families better. It's looking like a really exciting future. Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate your time on this podcast. Stay with us because we're going to have some more questions for you shortly. So thank you. Now, Spencer, you are our superstar here on our expert panel this afternoon because you are a young person with epilepsy yourself. So we're going to ask you a few questions, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I want to start off with knowing a little bit about you. What do you do in your spare time? What do you do for fun?
Well, I follow Coventry City Football Club.
Oh, all the downside.
So that's my first one. But mainly, hang around with my friends, go do normal things and just try and enjoy life.
That's great. Okay. So Spencer, tell me a little bit about your journey. How old were you when you were diagnosed with epilepsy?
I was just turning 18 when I was diagnosed, and it was a shock. I'd never thought anything like that would have happened. I was driving for 6 months, and one day had a seizure while I was driving. I crashed into a bus stop, and I remember the road just fading away while I was driving. And from then on, I've gone on to have about 9 seizures a month up until now, and I'm 23 now.
So what was it like for you on your diagnosis journey? You've heard today, we've talked to Colin and we talked to Mark about diagnosis. How was your diagnosis? How was your journey to get to that point?
Well, when I discovered that these things started happening, when I say these things, it felt like I was daydreaming. So I'd wake up somewhere and I didn't know how I got there. or I would wake up other side of Coventry, where I live, and not understand. And I brushed it aside for a long time, for a month, and just thought nothing of it. And the day where I knew I had to get it checked out was I went out clubbing with my friends and took my clothes off in the middle of the nightclub. So went and got it checked out from there. And
So go back a step,
yeah,
because I know you, we've had this conversation, but I want the listeners to hear that you were in this nightclub and you don't remember taking your clothes off. This was seizure activity that you were having. And when you came out of having that, it wasn't simple for you that evening, was it?
No. It was fair to say that the bouncers and the people there weren't very happy. I was being videoed. I had a lot of bruises from the bouncers, and yeah, that's when the realisation of everything came to me, that it needed to get checked out. And from the diagnosis, it's hard to explain, but for the listeners, when I got diagnosed with epilepsy, I was happy, because the consultant I saw before that said it's a tumour. And when you hear tumour, you think cancer, and unfortunately, you probably think death. So when I went back and we had this long process of being diagnosed and they told me it was epilepsy, I walked out of that room absolutely ecstatic. But I didn't realise what I thought was coming.
What were the challenges that you faced during this process?
Well, firstly, the realisation of what epilepsy is.
Did you know anything about epilepsy before?
No. So I have absent seizures, and I'd never heard of that before. Like everybody, you think lights affect you and you'll shake if you have a seizure. Where, no, I was completely wrong. I was doing all these crazy things, so walking round in the snow and lying down in the snow in the road and not realising what I was doing. And it was difficult. And if I'm being totally honest now, 6-7 years later, still is difficult.
What's difficult?
Trying to figure out life, trying to plan for life, when there's always this thing on the back of your shoulder that you make a step and it pushes you 2 steps backwards. And yeah, it's hard.
How do your family cope with it?
Truth be told, I don't know. They don't tell me much. But I certainly know they worry about me. Wherever I'm going or whatever I'm doing, they do their best for me to be safe. So we take the precautions. Wouldn't travel on my own. Just the little things like that.
And what about medications? Were you put on medication?
Yes, I was put on lacosamide, levetiracetam, Keppra, some people may know it as, Tegretol, Vicompa, and that's just to name a few, really. And not one medication has ever made a difference for me, not one.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Mm.
So when I talk to you about difficulties that you've had through your epilepsy journey, what would you say is the most difficult thing that you've had to navigate?
Losing my freedom, because I found a job in something that I loved. I was coaching football full-time. I was driving, and I was 17 at this point, just turned 18, and the world's my oyster. And that was the most difficult for when I had a seizure at work. The students and other colleagues there didn't like it, so that was me gone. So I couldn't work there anymore, and my driving licence got taken away. So suddenly, I'm back to square one at that point.
And then you're relying on people, help, lifts,
Yeah,
family,
yeah.
taking you here, there. Yeah.
To put it into perspective, while I was still at this coaching business, when I was a student, I drove. When I was a staff member, I got the bus.
That must have been difficult.
Yeah, very difficult.
So, looking at you now, and you're very confident, and you're very sociable, and you're very outgoing. What tips would you give somebody now if you looked back and thought, oh, what would I say to my younger self? What tips would you give to a young person going through that diagnosis journey currently?
Through the diagnosis journey, I would say stay happy, be happy, because it's not gonna be the best news, and we all know that. So why don't enjoy life in other areas? Exactly what I've done. Yes, I might have epilepsy, and it might affect my life in some ways, but who controls my life? Is it epilepsy or is it me? I made that decision when I got diagnosed, and it was me.
You're such a superstar. So when we're talking about, like, our listeners aren't just young people with epilepsy, they're family members as well.
Yeah.
What would you say to family members supporting young people with epilepsy? Because I know from my point of view in an epilepsy nurse world, some parents want to saturate that young person. You know, they never want to let them out of their sight ever again, and they completely lose all independence. What would you say to family members looking out for that young person, their young person?
Yes, it's something I actually think I'm quite strong on this subject as well. I think deeply about it, because my mum and dad, I'm an only child, and they basically let me do what I wanted to do with the precautions that we had, making sure I was safe and making sure I was all right. I meet a lot of families and meet a lot of people with epilepsy, and them young people with epilepsy aren't allowed the house past a certain time. They can't do these certain things. They're only going to rebel and do the same thing I'm doing, but without the precautions, and basically they wouldn't be safe because you don't know where they are. Where my parents know where I am. But because I'm allowed there, if they were worried and give me a call, I'd go back in, made sure that everyone was all right. So there has to be a balance towards it.
I think it's hard, though. Do you think it's hard, that balance? Because you want to fight for your independence, but as parents, we would want to go, oh my God, no, we don't want to let you out of our cotton wool ball because you're just so precious.
Yeah.
So I think there is a balance, but it's about how you navigate that balance.
It is, yeah. So to put it into perspective for everyone watching, I mean, I'm going to Turkey in August, and in September I'm in hospital for a month because I'm having brain surgery. And that basically sums it up, because what am I doing? I can't wait for Turkey. I'm enjoying what I'll be doing. But that's with the same thing that mum and dad know I'm going to be safe in Turkey. They know that I'll enjoy a holiday and then come back and we'll fight whatever's coming my way. Where that balance has to be met both ways, from the mum, the dad, and the young person with epilepsy. You have to find that balance.
And I guess it's hard. I mean, you said you're an only child, but I think for siblings as well, it must be really difficult to watch your brother, sister suffer.
Yeah.
And
No, definitely. And I think with siblings, there's lots of things you can probably do. For example, if Big Brother wants to go out, he can bring his little brother with him who has epilepsy, because he's got eyes on him there as well. Kick a football in the park. There's absolutely loads of things young people with epilepsy can do. So much.
So much. We don't talk about though, isn't it? So much, because we often, I always talk about is having epilepsy. It's living a perfectly normal life, just with a few lifestyle tweaks.
Yeah.
My mantra: a few lifestyle tweaks.
Yeah.
So, Spencer, what resources? Was there anything specific in resources that you found were helpful or useful to you?
Yes. So, funnily enough, Young Epilepsy.
No.
I watched a video. It was Renal, and he was talking about himself with epilepsy when he was at Barnet, and it really reminded me of myself when I was at my football college and I got diagnosed. And what I done was I went out of my way. I made a video similar to Renal's, and I sent it to Young Epilepsy, and I said, any chance that you can post this for me? They invited me in, and now I'm a trustee.
But that was the power of another young person, wasn't it?
Exactly.
That empowered you to do what you did. That's incredible. I think that's so nice to hear, actually, Spencer. So what do you wish you'd have known when you first started your epilepsy journey back when you were 18, and all that you've learned now over the course of the years that you've had epilepsy for? If you could look right back and go right back to the beginning, what's that one thing that you think, God, I wish I'd known that?
How many people epilepsy can affect. I really wish I knew that, because in some of my seizures, I can get violent, so it's absent seizures, and the amount of people in my family and my friends that have had to deal with it, I can't thank them enough, because they've stuck by my side, and with a good friendship group and a good family, you'll succeed in life.
That's lovely. Spencer, I mean, we've hung out a little bit in the past, so I know the answer to this question, but I'd really like the listeners to know this about you. What keeps you so super positive and really motivated about your epilepsy journey?
I think I want to inspire. Like Renal did for me when I first got diagnosed, I want to inspire young people that you can still achieve and get to places, because that day when I was 18, I lost my car, lost my job. I then went on to build a company with my friend, football coaching. I still do boxing coaching now. I ventured into new ventures, and I turn up at a boxing gym. Said I've got a brain injury, I've got a scar on my brain, epilepsy. Any chance I can start boxing? And to some people, probably wouldn't be the right thing to do, but to them, yeah, in you come. And the fact I done that, everyone watching you can do that, because epilepsy shouldn't stop anything.
And you're a real advocate for sport, aren't you? You think sport is such a great thing for young people to do.
Yeah, definitely.
And you're so good, I think, at inspiring young people, because that's what we want everyone to get involved. We spent time together at a football camp, didn't we?
Yeah, we did.
Last year for young people with epilepsy, children and young people. And it was so interesting to see, because epilepsy doesn't define somebody. It doesn't make you who you are. It's about leading that normal life. And that day, all the kids had a great time.
Yep.
But I know you're such an advocate for sport, which is keeping your physical health and your mental health in a good place.
Yes, definitely.
Is there any questions that you'd like to ask these lovely doctors that we've got here while we've got them here? Is there anything you want to ask them?
Talking about my medications earlier, I've tried them all. Why do do you think some medications work for people and medications don't work for others? So I've had no luck, but know plenty of people that medications work for.
Good question. Who wants to pick that up? Mark, have you got a comment on that?
The honest answer to that, Spencer, is we don't really know. There are clearly some types of epilepsy where we have a hunch right from the beginning that this type of epilepsy might not respond well to medication. And you've already mentioned that in some instances, then we might have to move on to other things like surgery. But why that epilepsy doesn't respond to drugs, we don't really know. There are some ideas about it. It might be, for example, that there is an abnormality, perhaps a genetically determined abnormality of the way in which the drug binds with the part of the brain where it's meant to act. So perhaps the drug actually can't fix onto that component properly because of a genetic variation. And there are also ideas about maybe there are some people whose brains, there is a system that creates a kind of boundary between your bloodstream and the brain, and it's designed to prevent toxic substances from getting into the brain. And it may be that in some people that operates in such a way that it either doesn't let the drugs in or it pushes them out very quickly so that they don't get a chance to act properly. But the honest answer, Spencer, is we don't really know.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you, Mark.
Colin, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I agree. We don't know, but we should know, and we should be doing a lot better, I think, in this space. And there's so many more drugs now, but often as a prescriber, you're still unsure which is the right one to choose. And there's some research going on in this, but I don't think there's enough. And I think a lot of the research isn't being done as well as it could be. It's often about getting the drug into the NHS or the health service, but there isn't enough exploring what drug works best for different types of people with different types of diagnosis. So there's a lot of guessing goes on.
Yeah, and historically, I think we often sit there and think, oh, we know that drug works really well because we've used it for many, many years on this type of epilepsy, so we'll do that one first.
Yeah, there's a lot of familiarity with drugs, and you know what's worked from your experience, and there's some research that helps you, but I think we need a lot more, and we're understanding so many different types of epilepsy, different seizure types, and we need to think, well, what works best for each of these types, and you need a different type of research approach, I think, than we're doing at the moment to learn from all the people with all their seizure types. And I think most people with epilepsy should be offered chance to go into some sort of research trial to have these questions answered. The questions we need answering need lots of people to participate in research. If they don't have to, but if they want to.
Absolutely.
Because unless we do that, we're going to stay in the dark and we'll still struggle to choose. So it's a big issue.
It's a minefield, isn't it?
It sort of leads us to this thing about how you collect information and learn from people in the health service.
Absolutely. Thank you. Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time, Spencer, today. I've really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you. I've got some questions around health information and its importance, and I think we've touched on already how important that is. So, Colin, let me put this question to you first and foremost. What is, for our listeners' point of view, what is health information and why is it so important for our young people?
Well, it's a precious thing, and it's their story about their health, and often we think about it traditionally in paper, what's written down, but it's essentially the story and collection of what's happening to them and all the other results of the tests that are done. So and it's the impact as well. So not just the things that tell you what the diagnosis is, but what happens after that. Which drugs are chosen, whether the side effects, whether they're effective, all that mass of information is really quite large, and at the moment it's still quite separated into compartments. And even though we now increasingly think of information in a digital sense. It's often all over the place.
Oh, absolutely.
And what we need is it to come together and be accessible, not just for patient care, but for all sorts of purposes, because often it's the wrong information at the wrong time.
Exactly. And I think individuals, they want their own information, don't they? And it doesn't seem to be, it's not joined up. It is as you're right, it is often different places. So how important is it for the information to belong to that individual and not just be so disjointed?
Well, it's vital. It's their information. It's about themselves. But we've got it wrong, I think, in health, and we've thought of it as our information. And obviously there's sensitivities about that, and information needs treating in confidence and interpreting, but that doesn't mean we need to think it's our information. And I think, as well as health, thinking about providing care in between appointments and changing how we think about delivery of care, we need to think about information and whose it is, and have it much more the sense that it's the person's information they're choosing to make it available, and it resides with them, and then the health system needs to somehow solve how do you then connect that information if it's their information. So there's challenges, but I think they're probably easier to solve when you think of information in digital systems rather than on a bit of paper.
Absolutely. Mark, that brings me to you. I think you'd like to comment on that.
I would say that the health information very definitely belongs to you as an individual and not to the hospital. And I completely agree with Colin. We haven't got that right in the past. I'd love to think that there are some really easy ways to join things up. Lots of us have the NHS app on our phones, for example, and many of us can see at least some of our GP record in the NHS app. But unfortunately, one of the massive obstacles in getting digital data together is, the system in your GP surgery that holds your information is different from the system in your hospital that holds your information, and the system in that hospital is different from the system in another hospital. And that lack of the way things can join up is a massive obstacle. And it isn't clear what incentives there are in the system for everybody to align all of that. But it just feels like such an obvious and important thing to do. And if we could do that, it might start to help us answer some of the questions that we've touched on already. So, for example, why does one drug work in one person but not in another person? Well, clinical trials of new drugs tend not to look at that kind of question. They just simply ask the question, does this new drug work better than a so-called placebo, a dummy drug? Well, you know what? Most of us don't really care about that question. As a clinician, I'm not interested in whether this new tablet is better than doing nothing. I'm interested in whether this new tablet is better than the best tablet that I've got already. So we really need trials that compare different treatments, head to head. And if we have a huge amount of information about people who are already been treated and have been treated in the past, out of that information we can extract, people who have similar profiles in terms of their type of epilepsy and their experience with epilepsy so far. But just by chance, the doctor for one of them might have put them onto one drug, and a doctor for another person might have put them onto a different drug. And in effect, we've got a sort of clinical trial that's gone on just in the natural run of people seeing their doctors and clinicians. But that information is really hard to get at. But if we could make all of that information so that it connects together, and if we can look after it in a way that's sufficiently confidential and private and secure, and we can allow researchers to get in there and have a look at that information, we may find that there's some real gold dust in there, that we might actually start to be able to identify, this treatment actually is better than that treatment in this particular kind of epilepsy or this particular type of person. And I think that's such an important opportunity. We've got to grasp it somehow, but there are lots of obstacles around that. the one being the systems don't connect, but the other is we need to do it in a way that everybody will trust and feel comfortable with.
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer, Mark. I think for me it's very frustrating. I had a family, for example, that their little girl was diagnosed in Scotland while on holiday with an epilepsy. However, when they came back down to us, we couldn't access any of their records, and it took a long time for the information to come down to us, and all the time the families are in limbo because they're waiting for the right hand to speak to the left hand. And I think it's really frustrating that every hospital you go to has a different system, and you go somewhere for something and go somewhere for, and no one talks to each other. These systems can't talk to each other. And you look where we are, where we've talked about digital technologies and technologies moving forward. How do we still have these fragmented, archaic systems in different hospital trusts? I think that's quite that's maybe not a question that you can answer, but I think it's frustrating.
It is really frustrating, but we have to solve that, because of some of the issues that patients face can't go on. So somehow the information needs to flow across the systems, and if we can get it right for patient care, then that's a good place to start. And the NHS app is a great example of how person's health information can flow and join up and be present for them. So I think we sort of need to build on that sort of thinking and mindset.
Because there was going to be a question about how do you think that ways of accessing our health information. So do you think the NHS app, Colin, is the way forward, or do you think we need a bigger piece of work around that?
Well, the notion is right, that there's a patient-facing place where they can see their health data, but it's got to connect, and all these different systems can't be allowed to operate in a marketplace where they can't or won't connect, and there has to be some collaboration. And I think the NHS is perfectly placed for that, because it is by design for everyone.
For the people, yeah.
And I think the way we allow vendors who produce the platforms into the NHS needs to come with a requisite that they're able to share information in confidential and appropriate ways, but the information has to join up, and it's too compartmentalised at the moment.
Absolutely. So how can families and young people themselves take ownership? How can they help us as healthcare professionals have access to their data? And because you obviously you sit in clinics, and you probably have the same thing. Parents turn up with notebooks with seizures and scrappy bits of paper.
Yeah, well, I think, for starters, asking for the information and not seeing it as the hospitals, but just wanting it and being curious and expecting to get it. When they get a letter in a paper sense, it should be to them and about them and for them, and have the information they need. So just this sense of I'm a patient, this is my information, I've got a right to have it and go after it, and then it's the responsibility of those who are building the systems and trying to create the health information to join it up. But patients need to be in the story and help us build trust, because it's so precious and private, this information. At the end of the day, the patient's going to have to trust the system they're part of. So it needs building together, and it's that coming together that I think that's really needed, literally, for health.
How do you think that could work, though, Colin? How do you think that would, if you look into the future and think this would be an ideal way forward, how do you think we as healthcare professionals can support our families, support our young people, support apps? And how do you think that would look? What would that look like to you?
Well, I think there has to be some political will to overcome market forces, just to be blunt.
Yeah.
Because I think we do that reasonably well for drugs and drugs entering the health system. We need to do the same for digital systems, and they need to be collaborative and cooperative by design. And I don't think we've got there yet. Some years ago the NHS thought about designing one big system that would do everything for everyone. They've opted to go for a model that has multiple systems, But, so I think that's here to stay probably. But if you're going to have multiple systems, they've got to talk to each other, and they don't do that yet. And there are emerging ways for communication to happen and for the information to flow and for it to be standardised. But it isn't just goodwill alone that is needed. There has to be some sort of political mindset, and that's why the NHS app is so good, because the notion of information flowing shows what can be achieved. So building from there, I think, is a really good model. But the whole framework of information and trust and sharing needs to be solved.
Because I think people could probably feel quite vulnerable, can't they? That their information, what could potentially go wrong with where their information goes, who sees their information.
There's risk and challenges and difficulties and trust and consent issues, but it's very empowering, I think, when a person has the information they need at the time they need it. It good can come out of it, and when they don't, it's very disempowering. Getting information right to support patient care is a really good place to start. So there's talks about passports and health passports and care plans, and people having the information about their epilepsy with them, and it's up to date and correct. And that's a really good place to start, because if you can solve that for the person and the right information is flowing, then other things can happen with that same information.
I agree. I think what's frustrating for me as an epilepsy nurse is we can't seem to standardise one epilepsy care plan currently. It seems frustrating as well that in every place I go, different people have different care plans for emergency or rescue medications for their young people, and that's a piece of work we've been working on for many years, of trying just to standardise one thing. And it seems again so frustrating that we're with all the technologies that Mark's talked about, all the technologies that we've got moving forward, why is it taking us so long to get to a place where we can standardise, when we can have one place for all of your health information?
Yeah.
Why is it taking so long?
It is complicated. I think we all talk about epilepsy as if we think we're talking the same language, and we maybe think about the patient understanding and the clinician understanding, but also between professionals we use different words for the same thing. And we've in epilepsy we've become quite good at using the same language maybe for seizure types or epilepsy syndrome types or diagnoses, but there's way more information from that, and we talk about it in our own way. And then it gets worse when we put it down paper. It gets even worse sometimes when we put it into our digital system. So this sense of let's communicate about health in the same way, and stop monopolising it, so that we have terms and language captured in such a way that it means the same thing across the systems.
Everybody.
That's a jump, because we're quite used to operating in our bubble. And we need to think, I think, in a much more different way for health information data, and probably not just nationally, but internationally we need to do it. But NHS is UK wide. Let's get
Start
it right
there.
for
Yes.
the UK,
Yeah.
because we have some means to influence and control the systems and the words we're using in our bubble. But it's not just our database, our platform, our words. It needs to be a wider issue. So political will, but I think the clinician's mindset as well needs to change a little bit. We just need to start agreeing where we can about language and terms.
How that would look, yeah. Mark, would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And I really think technology has an opportunity to help with that. So I could easily imagine in years to come that you might have a so-called AI agent running in your electronic information system in the hospital. And as you're using your own personal language, which exactly as Colin says, clinicians don't use the same words and the same terms. But as you're putting that into the electronic information system, the agent might say to you, oh, hang on, we've agreed across the epilepsy community that this is the terminology you should use. Shall I correct it for you? And I could easily imagine that some degree of standardization could happen like that. Just coming back to something that Colin mentioned about accessibility and sharing of data between people with epilepsy and clinicians. The best electronic information systems that are already available are extremely sophisticated. So, for example, where I work, we've just moved to a record system in the hospital where the person that I've seen in the clinic has an app on their own phone, can see directly their records. And I get little alerts every so often in my record that come from the patient saying, oh, doctor, you got this bit wrong. Correct that. Actually, I'm not on this drug, I'm on that drug, or you've got this dose wrong. So they can directly put information in themselves. And that system is capable of pulling in information from somebody's health diary, for example. So if somebody has an app where they're collecting a seizure diary and a medication diary and perhaps other symptom information, that goes straight into the record system too. So there can be this really fantastic flow back and forth. The massive problem, and again, Colin's mentioned this, is market forces. Those systems are colossally expensive. And I'm not sure the NHS can really afford to roll that out across the piece from that particular vendor. So, we need to find more cost-effective ways of crossing those barriers and integrating that information.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. I think we just need to think how exciting the future will be for moving forward, for technology, for data collection. It's not about collecting so much data, it's collecting the right data and making sure that we can better help and support our families and young people with epilepsy. Thank you all so much for your time today. I really appreciate the conversations that we've had. So thank you very much, Colin, Spencer and Mark. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me today on our podcasts. And thank you to our guests for sharing their insights and their very detailed experiences. We hope you found this episode useful and informative and helpful. And if you have any questions or you need any more information, please do visit our website. Links can be found below in our show notes. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on socials.
Together we create possible.